Over the past few weeks, there's been a bit of a shakeup on the Wild ladder. Even Shaman has already been a major contender, but Odd Rogue has really picked up steam. They started to streamline their builds to be more aggressive and became much more represented on the ladder due to Dog's massive 50-game win streak with the deck. This shift in the meta, while slight, has opened up some opportunities for decks on the ladder to come back, and one of the most primed to do so is Midrange Dragon Priest. This deck has only seen minor play in Wild since the release of Witchwood, and even back to Kobolds and Catacombs due to the overwhelming presence of Q-Block and Giant's Lock. The build we're featuring today has shifted significantly, looking more like a hybrid between Dragon Priest of old and the current standard Mind Blast Priest. Without further ado, let's hop into this retro deck made hip again through a bunch of new cards and a welcoming metagame. Midrange Dragon Priest is a deck which capitalizes on a more aggressive metagame while being able to hold its own against control decks. The goal of this deck against aggro is to stall until you have enough mana to start clearing their board. From there, you're able to outvalue them, and you win once they have run out of resources. Twilight Guardian is a really strong card at contesting a board until you have the mana to remove your opponent's minions. Traditionally, Duskbreaker is one of the best board clears in the game and does extremely well in a metagame with many totems and tokens, whether they be Silverhand Recruits or Pirates. This deck has a bunch of other board clears, including the synergistic Dragonfire Potion, the all-powerful Psychic Scream, and even Wild Pyromancer with 2 or 3 cheap spells. The ability for the deck to constantly clear wave after wave of threats allows it to shut out aggro decks and similar mid-range decks like Eevee Shaman. Against control decks like reynad and Druid, the deck struggles a bit, but it can be resourceful by using the damage engine of Shadow Reaper Anduin to chip away the opponent's health. The deck can also develop additional threats generated through Netherspite Historian, as well as ones copied from your opponent's deck using Draconid Operative. Significant cards in the deck include Divine Hymn, which is an efficient answer against burst damage by aggressive decks. You often need to be a bit greedy when stalling out with your board clears, and often your opponent will get you quite low in health. The extra 6 heal helps you stay out of burst range and can be combined with Wild Pyromancer for a clear or used to generate an extra Anduin hero power. Blackwing Corruptor can keep the board clear of single targets, but more importantly, it can be used as burst damage in matchups where you need to burn your opponent out. Previous iterations of Midrange Dragon Priest opted to cut this card for more early game threats, but as the deck becomes more mid-range, so too did the Corruptor become a good addition to this deck. Players can capitalize on this card in control matchups, as your opponent may not play around the 3 damage that the card generates, and you can sneak in a strong trade or surprise lethal burst. This card has similar utility to what Mind Blast does in Standard's Mind Blast Priest, and while it costs more, it's infinitely more flexible and can test extremely well against aggro compared to Mind Blast. Now let's go over some tech cards that make this deck a contender for the current Wild metagame. Midrange Priest is very versatile, and there's a lot of room to adapt your deck to the local meta. The build we're showing does well against most aggro decks, but if you feel that you're running into lots of aggro this early in the July season, Spirit Lash is a good inclusion in the deck, along with Blood Mage Thalnos. Both address the weakness of the deck's high-costed board clears, which often become clunky in the early game. Having an additional clear allows for more liberal use of them without waiting for maximum value or enough mana. With aggro considerations out of the way, you'll most likely be teching the deck against control-style decks. Against Highlander archetypes with Reno Jackson, Alexstrasza is a very solid card to include, as she can be set up for burst lethals, especially after your opponent has healed to full. There's a tech inclusion Eon popularized that does very well against both Q-Block and Reno Lock, which is Archbishop Benedictus. Often against these decks, you find yourself running low on value, and toward the late game, you tend to fall behind as your opponent stabilizes. This is a common problem for mid-range decks that don't draw well enough to pressure control decks in the early game. However, when running Archbishop Benedictus, you have the ability to generate significantly more threats while also being the last player to die to fatigue, which occurs a surprising amount of the time. Archbishop actually synergizes with Psychic Scream as well. Often in these matchups, you'll find yourself screaming a board of your opponent's minions with 1 or 2 of your small minions on board to pollute their deck. It really doesn't matter if your opponent gets your minions, as cards like Netherspite Historian or Duskbreaker make for a poor top deck by your opponent unless they happen to have dragon synergies. Even then, if you play the Archbishop, you'll get a copy of these cards back in your deck, which will remain significantly more valuable to you. Finally, if you really want to stick it to control decks, you can add in Mind Blast for extra burst to seal out the game. But this is only really necessary when you run into a lot of Druids. Speaking of Druid, 1 copy of Dirty Rat is run in this list primarily for Aviana Kun combo Druids. If you happen to face more Jade Druids which are gaining in popularity, this slot is easily replaced with Skulking Geist. Due to the adapting metagame becoming slower, Midrange Dragon Priest is making a return from its place of relative absence over the past few expansions. One way to stay on top of the wild metagame when the meta starts to change is to look back at decks from 2 to 3 expansions ago, and often you can find a gem or two that might come back to relevance, due to the decline of other decks that were keeping it from play. As always, please leave a like if you enjoyed this video and join the discussion in the comments below. Let us know what you would like us to cover in our next wild deck introduction. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and stay up to speed with all of Tempo Storm's Hearthstone news and content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.